After the blip in Australia, normal service has been resumed as Max Verstappen took the race victory, his 57th in his career. Red Bull take their fourth 1-2 at Suzuka, but beyond the Red Bull 1-2, it was tyre strategy and tyre offset the main story of the day. As well, of course, as Yuki Tsunoda taking his first points at his home Grand Prix. Before we get into all of that, though, let's take a quick look at the results following the 53-lap race. And it was, as we say, Max, a fantastic performance, finishing way ahead of his teammate Sergio Perez for a Red Bull 1-2. Then the two Ferraris coming home, but which order? Once again, Carlos Sainz beating his teammate, who did gain 4 places up from his qualifying position. Then it was the McLaren of Lando Norris, the Aston Martin of Fernando Alonso, a fantastic drive from him, keeping George Russell and Oscar Piastri right behind him. Lewis Hamilton coming home 9th for Mercedes, and as I say, Yuki Tsunoda scoring that valuable point and earning it in front of his home fans in 10th. Nico Hülkenberg coming home 11th for Haas, then the Aston of Lance Stroll in 12th, Magnussen 13th for the other Haas, the Sauber of Bottas, the two Alpines of Ocon and Gasly, with Logan Sargent coming in last in 17th. And last, because no Zhou Guanyu, no Daniel Ricciardo and no Alex Albon making the end. They were all DNFs. Well, I'm Bryn Lucas, and joining me to talk through all the Japanese Grand Prix happenings, we have Filip Cleeren, and there at the track itself, Alex Kalinauckas. Gents, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hello, yes. In the dark at Suzuka, everything's being packed up over and in front of my shoulders, and yeah.
Now, first question for you, Alex, really, other than that, is what's the Blossom like? JBL was very jealous he wasn't going to get to see the Blossom.
Very picturesque. I haven't seen a great deal of it around sort of in the paddock. It's very concretey, let's put it that way. But definitely on the edge of the track. I think FOM did manage to find quite a few camera shots to get it in, and yeah, it's absolutely charming.
Well, let's kick it off with what we saw out on track. And I think really what we should do, Phil, is we were talking on the preview about how Mercedes was saying that they seem to be operating better at colder temperatures, and then we were saying, how's Japan going to work, it being earlier in the year? So what are your thoughts then, tyre strategy, the different time of the year that the Japanese Grand Prix was held?
Yeah, it looked like Mercedes were going to be helped by the colder conditions, which I think you saw in qualifying. But then on race A, it was a lot warmer than on Saturday. I think the track temperature was about 14 degrees up. And certainly during the first stint, it looked like Mercedes were struggling with that. If there's a connection, we don't know exactly, but that's what it looked like. And then I think a lot of drivers commented that it started getting really cloudy during the second half of the race, and then that helped track degradation a lot. So possibly that's why Mercedes were a little bit better by then, but then the damage was already done, because in particular, Lewis had a really poor first stint, had some issues. And that cost him and George Russell a lot of time before they made the swap. So they were on the back foot pretty much straight away, especially compared to Ferrari and McLaren, who started up front and stayed there easily.
Alex, over there, you get to see the drivers, not just you hear from them, but you get to see their body language and things. And Mercedes had this strategy after the red flag that they were going to do this hard tyre, change their concept to a one-stop. Do you think that was all down to the temperature and they were caught out by that as well, and hoping that they could just get the car through it being warmer than they were expecting?
I think when it came to the red flag and putting on hard tyres, it was more just about building in strategic flexibility. Like, there was a bit of chat coming into this weekend that the one-stopper might be possible. Leclerc proved it was. And I think Mercedes, ultimately, that's what they wanted to do, but quite quickly found that the pace wasn't going their way and they had to readapt. So yeah, sort of a case of what might have been for that team.
Just mentioned the one-stop strategy of Leclerc. Now, Max Verstappen was saying prior to this, he was a bit concerned about the pace that Ferrari was showing and Leclerc's ability to do a one-stopper. Do you think that had Ferrari been able to have maybe qualified slightly better than they had, particularly Leclerc, that they could have put on a real challenge for the race win?
I think race win definitely out of the question, but I think it probably would have been a little bit closer. There was a lot of chat about the strong Ferrari race runs, even back from FP1. Helmut Marko called Leclerc's opening long run rather irritating, but which is fairly mild from him, but there we go. I think actually more than that, it's just come down to the fact that basically Red Bull sandbags in practice. Ferrari, to a certain extent, does that a little bit less, and I think that Carlos Sainz was pretty open and honest after qualifying, saying, "Yep, we were just that a little bit lighter." So even if they'd started third and fourth on the grid behind the two Red Bull drivers, I don't see them mounting a challenge here at this sort of more rear limited circuit. I think it's Ferrari needs very specific conditions to be able to topple Red Bull, where the front limited tracks where graining is a big issue. China next weekend, or whenever it is, 2 weeks time, that could be a big opportunity for Ferrari. But no, I don't see that this was an opportunity lost for Ferrari.
And obviously the track position also dictates the strategy, doesn't it? So, had Leclerc qualified up front, would he have gone for a two-stop? Probably not, because it turned out not to be the fastest strategy. It was just a way for him to get back into the race, and who knows, if a safety car or red flag happens, he can benefit from that. But I don't think there's a lot to be said. I think still two-stop was across the board quicker, so we'll never really know. But as Alex said, this kind of circuit was always going to be a little bit trickier for Ferrari compared to Red Bull, but perhaps China and Miami will be a little bit easier for them. The
tyre offset was a big talking point, I suppose. I mean, it seems that Red Bull and Ferrari pretty much got it right. The other two, there are more than other two teams in the championship, but the other two, McLaren and Mercedes, they didn't get it right. But is that a hindsight thing, Phil? Do you think that they could look back and say, well, based on what we knew at the time, it was the right decision? Or do you think they'll look back and say, we did get it wrong?
I don't think so, because to me, Ferrari and McLaren really just finished where they should have finished, where they deserve to finish. Mercedes as well. I think it's very clear now that we've got a clear hierarchy: Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes, in that order. And depending on the track, depending on the conditions, maybe one team will be slightly closer or slightly ahead. But to me, the result was nothing unexpected, really. We saw that McLaren are, good in qualifying. Lando did a really good lap, I thought. Obviously, Charles didn't, so that helped them a bit. But there was really no question of Lando hanging on to that podium. I don't think he was easily passed by Perez and Sainz. So I think they just all pretty much finished where they needed to finish.
Earlier in the week, though, Alex, during FP1, I think in FP2, Lewis was saying that he was enjoying it the most that he has, I'm paraphrasing, but enjoying it the most he had so far this season. It was the best performance he had, and it didn't seem to materialise, particularly when you see that he finished all the way down in ninth.
Yeah, I think Lewis's comments more reflected the fact that the team worked hard to make sure they could maintain that through corner balance and the tyre temperatures on both axles. So if they can achieve that, the car is naturally going to feel a lot better for a driver. But it's, as Phil said, Mercedes finished and really qualified where it should do in terms of the sort of the pace and the performance of the car that we've seen so far this year. But I think the critical thing that actually, by a very small margin, Mercedes weekend could have potentially, at least the race could have started off a lot differently. They were on the wrong side of a 1/10 split across four teams. So that's McLaren, Ferrari, Aston Martin and Mercedes. And potentially if Hamilton had started a lot higher up, maybe things do go on to be a little bit differently. But yeah, I think also there's various things. The wind had turned around quite a bit this year, some nice sort of headwind through the S's section. So the car is naturally going to feel a little bit better for the drivers. And honestly, Lewis was like, the car felt great, but it's half a second down to the Red Bull or whatever it was, or the time in qualifying. Can't remember it off the top of my head. But yeah, that's what it is. Unfortunately, things might feel nice, but that's the reflection of where Mercedes is in this battle this year.
Phil, you mentioned this kind of pecking order: Red Bull, then it's the Ferrari, then Mercedes and McLaren. But what about Aston Martin, and what about particularly Fernando Alonso? Another fantastic drive from him.
Yeah, excellent across the board, I thought. Starting on softs didn't really work out the way they maybe wanted to, but he just had a really good performance all the way through the race, both defensively, keeping their tyres under control, keeping Piastri behind and such, and Russell at the end. Just a really good drive, which Fernando agrees with, because at the end he said, this is one of my best ever races, or best top 5 ever, which is something he does seem to say every other week. But to his credit, it was a good race. yeah, I think most people would still argue Aston is the 5th team in the pecking order, even if it's by a very small margin. So if you are able to qualify out of position a bit, in Alonso's case, and try and stay there with strategy, with DRS games, I think he was trying to keep Piastri in his RS range, the way Sainz did in Singapore last year. So, all the tricks of the trade, no brake testing or anything like that, just good old defensive masterclass, and it's just a very good drive.
Yeah, it's exactly what he needed after the sort of cloud that had been hanging over him, since Melbourne. Let's rewind just a few days. Like, some people are openly criticising and questioning his tactics against George Russell in the Melbourne race. So I think it's the perfect riposte. It's a very Fernando Alonso riposte, as Phil says, declaring this the best of the best of the best that is of that that amazing selection that he's got of his best races. But yeah, again, let's look at the venue. It's a proper old school, brutal track where the best drivers really can make the difference, and look at the absolute chasm between him and his teammates. Like, Fernando's showing what the Aston can do, and Lance Stroll letting teams that really should have no chance of scoring points, in this case RB and Yuki Tsunoda, we'll get to later. Lance gave away his point again by poor qualifying and not being able to make up for it in the race.
Looking a little bit further back, and his teammate Lance Stroll, well, he did all he could, didn't he? He tried to get up to the back of Yuki Tsunoda, ended up falling behind Nico Hülkenberg. But for Yuki Tsunoda, what a great result. He gets that valuable point, but he does it in front of his home fans. What was the response like?
Yeah, fantastic weekend for Tsunoda. He's continued his rapid start to the year when it comes to qualifying, and yeah, he was actually quite unlucky at the start. I thought both RB drivers getting swamped because they took that initial start on the medium tyres, and as Pirelli had been insisting, some teams are going to put the softs on at the start to try and get the jump on others, and it worked very well for them, and in fact doubly so in the case of Ricciardo, because it just put him back into a position where obviously he probably wasn't expecting to be, and he got a little bit caught out. So yeah, another disaster, not what he needed in terms of this sort of reputation damaging start to the season that he's had, but the exact opposite for Tsunoda. Just on the radio complimenting the team after slick pit stops, passes at the S's, delighting his home crowd, and yeah, absolutely fantastic. And I just thought, just on the home crowd front, obviously this is the first time the Japanese Grand Prix, I know it's not the first time that a Grand Prix in Japan has been held in the spring, but the first time this race has been held in the spring. So everybody seems pretty happy with it. I think FOM, suggesting that it makes things a lot easier for their freight requirements and getting things worked around with, trying to make this calendar at least a little bit more sustainable. So that's a good tick. I think my understanding is that perhaps slightly down on ticket sales, not by a lot, but just reflecting the fact that the last race was only 6 months ago. So I think with that in mind, everybody's very pleased with how the change to bring the Japanese Grand Prix to the spring has gone, and I expect it to be back in similar sort of slot next year, maybe a little bit earlier, obviously, because we know the Middle Eastern races are going back because of Ramadan in 2025.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. Just a really good race. We've jokingly said before that in the midfield, whoever wants to score points has to be the guy that beats Stroll, and today we had two people doing that. We have Tsunoda and Hülkenberg, and if you look at the gap, there are only like 4 or 5 seconds in between them. So it's a very tight battle there, obviously, and it will be probably for the entire season, really, depending on who develops best. But it's so important that once you have the opportunity here, you just need to bang the points whenever you can, because they're going to be hard to come by for all of these people. So yeah, perfect performance. Hasn't really been mentioned too much in terms of being a candidate for Red Bull, but it's done a perfect job under a lot of pressure in front of his home fans, but it just seemed to glide off him, really. He didn't seem to be fazed by that. Obviously, it's very easy to be well behaved on the radio if everything goes well. So we'll have to see what happens if we get some more adversity, how he's really improved on that front. But so far, he's had a super solid start to the season.
So a great result for Yuki Tsunoda, but not a great result for his teammate Daniel Ricciardo, who once again struggled. He went off in turn 2, didn't he, with that collision? So first of all, what are your thoughts on the incident and the wider issue of what's going on with Daniel Ricciardo, Alex?
Yeah, I think just on the crash itself, hard to really see what else Albon could have done. He recognises Ricciardo's coming across, he slams on the brakes, and it just unfortunately isn't enough. I think Ricciardo will point to the mitigating circumstances that he was aware Stroll was slightly on his inside, but equally if he'd been a bit more decisive and cutting in ahead of the Aston Martin rather than drifting to the right, the crash may not have occurred. So yeah, the stewards just saying if it hadn't been lap one, maybe some sort of penalty would have applied, although didn't get into details of which way that would have gone. But yeah, as we said earlier, considering everybody came into 2024 expecting Ricciardo to blow Tsunoda away, Perez to continue being underwhelming against Verstappen, and that it was is a Red Bull promotion to lose for Ricciardo. It's very hard to see it happening now, considering everything that's going on with the turmoil of the driver market. Ricciardo just isn't showing what certain factions within the Red Bull camp want.
Well, from one driver who's struggling to a team that seems to be struggling, and that is struggling with the number of chassis they have. And another issue for them this weekend with Alex Albon going off, and that is Williams. They got China in a couple of weeks' time. Just how damaging is this for them? Because they've spent more time repairing the car than they have racing it.
Yeah, this is a really big blow again for Williams, because it's another chassis that has to be repaired in the factory in Grove, be pressed into action again in China. They're already on the back foot with producing chassis in time for Miami now. It's another delay. And it's not just about the chassis, it's also about all the other spare parts that have been damaged over the last couple of weeks. They also need man hours, they need time, resources to produce them. And with the budget cap and where Williams is at, they're not going to have too many spare parts. They're going to be very limited as well. So at some point, it is going to be an issue for them if they keep damaging stuff, because they clearly cut some corners, took a gamble on minimizing how much they produce so they can upgrade later. And clearly, with all the repairing that has been done, this will inevitably down the road delay some of their upgrades coming forward as well. So it's not just short-term pain now; it might also be a long-term handicap for them this season.
Well, Alpine, they've been struggling, haven't they, recently? But Pierre Gasly seemed to be quite happy with the upgrades they've made. What are your thoughts on their race?
Yeah, I think they were fairly open coming into the weekend that the update wasn't going to massively change their place in the pecking order, and it bore out in the race. So Ocon, again, does very well to get out of Q1, but when you've got two cars that qualify ahead crashing out, and then you finish further back from where you started, it's really not... it's really not gone well. It's reflective of the tricky position Alpine is in. But critically, I understand that the front wing upgrade brought a nice bit of weight saving to the car, so things are going in the right direction on that. That's a big factor in why Alpine have been so far off the pace. So more of that, I think, from the team, and hopefully, bigger upgrades will potentially propel them up the pecking order later in the year.
Keep looking at teams with woes, don't we? And Sauber, Valtteri Bottas had a pretty decent showing actually, but Sauber seems to be really, really struggling with their pit stops. When will this problem be resolved?
It's definitely not fixed yet. I think you saw that in the race with the stops taking around about 4 seconds. They were just giving themselves much more margin, but I think hopefully they're looking more towards China for a permanent or a long-term holding fix to be the situation there. But yeah, other than that, it was a pretty underwhelming weekend for Sauber. Zhou Guanyu qualifying down the back of the grid. Not a lot else to really say about the team overall. So yeah, again, the focus is on pit stops and poor reliability as well, because Zhou retired with another gearbox problem.
I think we should really finish on a high, though, don't you? And that is Carlos Sainz. Great results for Red Bull, obviously the 1-2, and we shouldn't just gloss over it entirely. But Carlos Sainz, I mean, he's outperforming his teammate, has done it again, looks very, very strong, and he hasn't got a contract for 2025. When will this be resolved?
You finally get the sense that he's sort of, the first time this weekend there's been a little bit of needle of come on Ferrari, why have you dropped me? Like, what more could I be doing? Helmut Marko greeting him very effusively in the paddock. I think there's meetings between the Red Bull camp and the Sainz's camp this weekend, so he's in with a shot, but it's too much of an unknown with what's going on at the top of Red Bull right now to be able to make sort of safe predictions on that front. Mercedes could potentially be another option for him but equally that team is waiting to see what's going to happen with Kimi Antonelli in F2, and then where else does that leave him? Aston Martin, maybe that they're leaning more now towards hoping to re-sign Fernando Alonso, although that being the most likely scenario. So again, it's back to what Sauber and Audi. But is that really where a driver of Sainz's calibre should be ending up? Based on how Sauber are at the moment, that would be a big step down for him.
Yeah, as Alex said, it really depends on not only who is going to be picked, but who's going to do the picking, who is going to make the decisions there. So is it all going to be Christian Horner from now on? Is that going to be challenged? Is that going to be changed come summertime? They said by the summer they want to make a decision. They're happy to wait until then. So we don't know what the situation will be by then. But in the meantime, Perez is doing what he needs to do, really. But he does need to keep confirming this, because we've seen in the past, we've had a false dawn with him 2 years ago when he was challenging Max for race wins, and then it just sort of fell off the cliff. So they really want to see him confirm that now until the summer, rather than dropping off again.
Thanks very much, gents. Before we disappear for this one, let's have a look at the championship standings. And we can see it's Max Verstappen leads the way, 77 points over his teammate now. Yes, Sergio Perez jumps above Charles Leclerc on 64 points. Then it's the two Ferraris, as I say, Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz Jr. on 55. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, so the McLaren's very much making that third place in the constructors theirs, aren't they, at this stage? George Russell, then Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton way down in 9th after 4 races, and then Lance Stroll creeping his way still into 10th position. Yuki Tsunoda climbs up to 11th. Oliver Behrman is still there in 12th. Hülkenberg, Magnussen, Albon, Guan Yu, Ricciardo, Ocon, Gasly, Bottas and Logan Sargent there, with quite a few of them still yet to score. When we have a look at the constructors, and as you see, Red Bull are well and truly ahead, 141 points now, 21 ahead of Ferrari. McLaren in 3rd, Mercedes in 4th, and 34 just ahead of Aston Martin. That's going to have a battle right the way to the end, you suspect, don't you? RB in 6th, Haas in 7th on 4 points. Then Williams, Sauber and Alpine still yet to score as well. Well, as always, thanks very much to Alex and to Phil for joining us. Thanks to you for watching. And don't forget the Chinese Grand Prix is coming up, the first time returning to China since 2019. And if you've liked what you've seen on this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can keep up to date with everything Formula One. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.